Gregg v. Georgia and the 18th Amendment by Sophia, Jordan, and Xander. The Gregg v. Georgia case dealt with the 8th Amendment that states excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. It was ratified in 1791, and there was controversy over the cruel and unusual punishment clause. Troy Leon Gregg was found guilty and was sentenced to death by the Georgia court system. He took his case to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court upheld Georgia's decision. He fled the prison the night before his execution, where he got into a bar fight in North Carolina and was killed. The state of Georgia held and tried Gregg for the armed robbery and 2 murders committed in 1973. He was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to death. Gregg appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court in 1976, but they upheld the death penalty sentences for the murders, but actually reversed the death penalties as the sentence for robbery charges. He then made a final attempt to have his case overturned and appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Troy Gregg argued that Georgia's application of the death penalty was inconsistently decided. He also argued that his capital punishment violated the 8th Amendment and due process. He used the Supreme Court ruling as death penalty as cruel and unusual punishment from the Furman v. Georgia case as evidence to support his argument.
Georgia went on to argue that their system of checks and balances made it nearly impossible for the impartial sentencing of the death penalty. This process gives the accused a 2-part review system. First, the case must be heard and decided by the lower courts, where a jury will make the decision for a death penalty sentence. The second and most essential part of the process is the mandatory appellate review. This part requires that the decision made by the lower courts be sent up to the Georgia Supreme Court, with the evidence and circumstances being considered once again to determine if the death penalty is an appropriate sentence. In Gregg's case, the evidence and circumstances validated his capital punishment for the murders. The majority vote ruled that the death penalty was constitutional in a 7-2 vote. The majority vote was made on July 6, 1976. Justices Brewer, Stewart, White, Blackmun, Power, Rehnquist, and Stevens voted for the majority. Potter Stewart wrote the majority opinion. The majority said that they couldn't overrule the judgment of Georgia's legislature as to the usefulness of the death penalty. Justices Blackmun and White had concurring opinions, or opinions that agreed with the use of the death penalty on the trial. The concurring opinion pointed out the lack of merit in Gregg's appeal, stating that the Furman decision gives the Supreme Court the ability to review judicial process and decide if capital punishment decided by jury is objective and fits the crime. In the 7-2 vote, both dissenting Supreme Court justices, or the justices who opposed the death penalty sentence, made statements. Justice Brennan spoke of the country's morality of putting one of its own to death and pointed out the cruel and unusual punishment clause. Justice Marshall agreed with Brennan and said popular opinion would reject his punishment given all the facts. The dissenting opinions differed from the concurring opinions in the way it pointed to morality instead of looking at past cases like Furman v. Georgia and the severity of the crime. The significance of this case was that it established which cases could and couldn't be justified in enforcing the death penalty as a punishment. The Gregg v. Georgia case involves the 8th and 14th Amendments.
Gregg v. Georgia is still relevant to this day. There are people all across the United States who are sentenced to death every single year. Across the country, there aren't too many cases, but last year 25 people were put to death. In 2005, the only real change to the Supreme Court's constitutional status of the death penalty occurred. It was ruled unconstitutional for people under 18 to be put to death. The precedent to this case lies in the Furman v. Georgia case in 1972, 4 years before Gregg v. Georgia, where the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional due to its inconsistency of the form of execution. The 2 pictures on this slide represent where the death penalty is allowed or enforced. On the top left corner, you'll see the United States. The states in red on this map are states where the death penalty is still allowed, while the states in blue on this map are states where the death penalty is no longer allowed. However, if a case from, let's say, Wisconsin made it to the Supreme Court level, since it's still allowed by the Supreme Court, the person could get the death penalty. Looking in the bottom right corner, you'll see a map of the world. The countries in red on this map are countries that put someone to death in 2018. A standout from each continent would be Egypt, who executed at least 61 people, the United States, who executed 25, China, whose number is unknown due to them not releasing a statistic, but it's estimated by experts to be over 1,000, and Belarus, which is at 4 or more. South America did not have any country put someone to death, and Australia was the same situation. Shifting away from Gregg V. Georgia, let's talk about the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is more commonly known as the amendment that started Prohibition. Now, it's a common misconception that Prohibition bans the consumption of alcohol, but it actually just bans the sale, transportation, or making of intoxicating liquids, which includes and most commonly applies to alcohol. So that means that if you had stockpiled up before Prohibition went into effect, you could drink all the alcohol you wanted. So the road to Prohibition really started in 1913 with the establishment of the income tax. Now, the opposition to Prohibition before was seen in that alcohol taxes brought in a big amount of government funding, and if they got rid of alcohol, the government may not have enough money. When a new tax came along that could fill this void, talks of Prohibition became more and more serious. World War I was where a lot of people shifted towards Prohibition, and this was helped along by religious lobbyists. One of the main groups in this was the Mormons. And commonly cited was the fact that Prohibition worked before reducing the crime rate in the state of Maine when it was in effect. Prohibition and the 18th Amendment were enacted on January 1919 and lasted for 14 years before being repealed in the 21st Amendment in December of 1933. Now, a big controversy was the tons of illegal sales of alcohol. Here are our sources for this project.